What if the Australian accent was not carefully passed down from Britain, but born by accident, inside a brutal colony at the edge of the world? In 1788, ships full of British convicts reached Sydney Cove. They carried poverty, crime, fear, punishment, and dozens of different voices from across Britain and Ireland. But what came out of that colony was not London English. It was something stranger, sharper, flatter, more defiant. And the real twist? It may not have been the adults who created the Australian accent. It may have been their children. Because when the first fleet arrived on the shores of Australia, it did not just bring prisoners. It brought a storm of broken voices. Voices from alleys. Voices from farms. Voices from ports. Voices from jails. Voices from Ireland, London, the Midlands, and the poor streets Britain wanted to forget. And when those voices were trapped together under a burning new sky, far away from the motherland, something began to change. Something no governor ordered. Something no king approved. Something no one could stop. A new voice was being born. And it did not sound like London. Not anymore. Most people hear the Australian accent today and think it is just a funny version of British English. A British accent left out in the sun too long. A relaxed voice from beaches, barbecues, cricket fields, and dusty roads. But that is the clean version. That is the safe version. The real story is darker. Because the Australian accent did not begin in comfort. It began in exile. It began with chains. It began with ships crossing a dangerous ocean, carrying people who had been thrown away by their own country. Imagine it. The year is 1788. The sea is endless. The air below deck is damp and foul. Men and women lie crowded together, sick, hungry, afraid. Some had stolen food. Some had stolen clothing. Some had done worse. Some are barely more than children. Britain called them criminals. But many of them were also poor, desperate, hungry, unwanted. And now they were being sent to a land most of them would never leave. They were not sailing toward a dream. They were sailing toward punishment. And every night, beneath the sound of waves and timber, you would have heard them speaking, but not with one voice. One man curses in a London street accent. A woman prays with an Irish rhythm. A sailor shouts in a hard coastal dialect. A guard gives orders in a clipped military tone. A prisoner from the countryside speaks in sounds another prisoner barely understands. This was not one Briton. This was many Britons, broken into pieces, thrown into the same wooden prison. And when that prison reached the other side of the world, those pieces did not stay separate. They collided. Sydney Cove was not a polished city. It was mud, tents, hunger, fear, and hard labor. There were no grand boulevards, no old churches standing for centuries, no familiar streets where people could protect the accent of their village or class. The old world had been cut away, and in that raw place, language began to lose its borders. A child born there would not hear just one way of speaking. They would hear everything. They would hear the rough speech of convicts, the barked commands of soldiers, the softer words of mothers trying to survive, the sharp jokes of workers, the whispers of people who still dreamed of home. And because children are not careful historians, they did not preserve each accent perfectly. They blended them. They smoothed them. They chose what worked. They dropped what did not. Without knowing it, they became the first true makers of a new colonial sound. That is the part most people miss. The convicts brought the ingredients, but the children may have cooked the accent. They were born in a place their parents still saw as punishment. But to them, it was home. They had never walked through London fog, never seen an Irish village, never stood in a British marketplace. Their ears belonged to Australia. Their mouths belonged to Australia. And slowly, the sound of the colony began to drift away from the sound of the empire. This is why the Australian accent sounds nothing like modern London, because it was never copied from modern London. It came from older voices, working voices, lower-class voices, regional voices, voices that Britain did not celebrate, voices that polite society often looked down on. In a strange way, the Australian accent carries the ghost of people Britain tried to silence. That is what makes it powerful. It was not born in the drawing rooms of the rich. It was not born in universities. It was not born from kings, lords, or polished speeches. It was born from people under sentence. People who had lost almost everything. People who had been pushed to the edge of the map. And at the edge of the map, their voices survived. But then came another twist. The accent did not just form because people spoke differently. It formed because the colony had to become something different. In Britain, your accent could tell people your class, your region, your education, your place in the social order. A voice could open a door, or close one forever. But in the early colony, the social order was unstable. A prisoner could become a worker. A worker could become a landholder. A soldier could become poor. A convict could raise children who no longer sounded like convicts. The old rules were still there, but they were cracked. And through those cracks, a new voice pushed through. A voice that was less polished, less formal, less obedient. A voice that did not bow as deeply. A voice that seemed to say, I know where I came from, but you do not own me anymore. That is why the Australian accent carries a strange emotional force. It sounds casual, but beneath that casual sound is distance. It sounds relaxed, but beneath that relaxation is survival. It sounds playful, but beneath the humor is defiance. The accent became a kind of mask, a shield, a way of speaking that did not worship the old empire too openly. And that mattered, because Australia was not just far from Britain. It was impossibly far. For the people who arrived there, the ocean was not just water. It was a wall between old names and new lives, a wall between shame and reinvention, a wall between the voice you were born with and the voice your children would inherit. Over time, that wall changed everything. The colony kept receiving new people, more convicts, more settlers, more Irish voices, more British voices, more speech from different regions and classes. But the children kept doing what children always do. They made the chaos normal. They turned noise into pattern. And by the early generations born in Australia, something recognizable had begun to appear. A sound that was no longer simply British. A sound that belonged to the colony. And here is where the mystery becomes even more unsettling. The accent was not just a way of speaking. It became a way of belonging. Because in a place built on exile, belonging was not simple. Many early settlers were ashamed of convict origins. Some tried to hide them. Some wanted to sound more refined, more British, more respectable. Others leaned into the roughness. They treated the Australian way of speaking as honest, plain, tough, real. And so the accent split into different faces. There was the broad Australian accent, the one many people think of first. Strong, flat, open, full of swagger, the voice of the bush, the worker, the rebel, the joker who laughs in the face of danger. Then there was the general Australian accent, more common, more everyday, the voice heard in schools, homes, streets, offices, television, and ordinary life. Still Australian, still distinct, but less extreme. And then there was the cultivated accent, the one closer to British speech, more careful, more upper class, more polished. For a long time, this cultivated voice carried status. It sounded educated to some, respectable, official, but it also sounded to others like surrender, like someone was still trying to please Britain from across the sea. So even inside Australia, the accent became a battlefield, not with guns, but with vowels, with rhythm, with the way a person said a simple word. Because every accent carries a hidden message. It tells people where you are from, but also who you wish to be. And Australia was still asking that question. Was it a British colony? A prison wound? A new nation? A rough experiment? A home? A place of shame? Or a place of rebirth? The accent held all of those answers at once. But there's another reason Australian English sounds so different from London today. And it is one of the easiest things to forget. London changed too. When people ask, why does Australian not sound like London? They imagine London as a fixed thing, as if the London of 1788 is the same as the London of today. But language never stands still. London kept changing. Its people changed. Its class system changed. Its migration changed. Its slang changed. Its streets changed. Its sound changed. So Australian English was not moving away from a frozen London. Both voices were moving, but they were moving in different worlds. One kept evolving inside Britain. The other evolved across the ocean, under different skies, shaped by different pressures, different shame, different pride, different myths. That is why Australian English can feel familiar and foreign at the same time. It is like hearing a cousin whose family left generations ago. You recognize something old, but has been transformed. It carries a family resemblance, but does not belong to the old house anymore. And then there is the land itself. Now, no serious story about Australia can pretend the land was empty. Before the first fleet arrived, Aboriginal peoples had lived there for tens of thousands of years. They had their own languages, their own law, their own memory, their own sacred relationship with country. So when British voices arrived, they did not arrive into silence. They arrived into a world already full of ancient voices. And that is the darker truth behind this story. The birth of the Australian accent happened inside a much larger history of colonization, a history of displacement, a history of violence, a history where one set of voices grew louder while many older voices were pushed aside. That does not make the accent less fascinating. It makes it more haunted, because every national voice has ghosts inside it, and the Australian accent carries more than convict slang and British dialects. It carries the sound of a new society forming on top of an older world. It carries the tension of people trying to become free while others were losing freedom. It carries comedy and pain, sunlight and shadow, pride and silence. That is why the story cannot be told as a simple joke. It is not just convicts talked funny and Australians inherited it. No, it is deeper than that. It is the story of empire losing control of its own voice. Britain sent people away to punish them. But those people helped create something Britain could not fully claim. A new sound, a new identity, a new way of being heard. And perhaps that is the most powerful part. The Australian accent was accidental. But once it existed, it became meaningful. It became a sign that distance had changed the children of the colony. It became proof that the empire's unwanted people had not simply vanished. They had spoken, their children had spoken, and their voice had survived. Think about that for a moment. A government can build prisons. It can write sentences. It can send ships across the ocean. It can rename places. It can command bodies. But it cannot fully control what children do with language. It cannot stop a new accent from forming in playgrounds, kitchens, docks, farms, and streets. It cannot stop a punished people from becoming ancestors. It cannot stop a voice from escaping. That is what happened in Australia. Not in one dramatic moment. Not with one person. Not with one sentence. But slowly, quietly, over years. A child repeated a word differently. Another child copied it. A family kept it. A street normalized it. A generation carried it. And then one day, the colony no longer sounded like the place that had created it. The accent had crossed an invisible line, and there was no going back. That is why the Australian accent still feels so strong today. It is not only the sound, it is the attitude hidden inside the sound. The informality, the humor, the refusal to sound too impressed, the suspicion of people who act superior, the warmth of calling someone mate, the sharpness of turning pain into a joke. The strange musical pull of vowels that seem to stretch toward the horizon. You can hear a whole history inside it. The ships, the chains, the laughter, the dust, the mothers, the children, the guards, the workers, the shame, the rebellion, the country becoming itself. And still, the mystery remains. Did British convicts create the Australian accent? Yes, but not alone. They planted the raw material. Their voices were the broken stones. But the accent was built by the colony, by distance, by class, by children, by survival, by the need to belong somewhere new. And that is why it sounds nothing like London. Because it was never just London. It was London mixed with Ireland, mixed with regional Britain, mixed with prison yards, mixed with working class streets, mixed with ocean distance, mixed with colonial childhood, mixed with the desire to stop being only what Britain said you were. In the end, the Australian accent is not a failed British accent. It is not a damaged copy. It is a living record of separation, It is what happens when history tears people from one world and forces their children to build another. It is what happens when punishment becomes population, when exile becomes home, when shame becomes identity, and when voices that were meant to disappear become impossible to ignore. So the next time you hear an Australian say mate, listen closely. Do not just hear the casual sound. Hear the ocean behind it. Hear the creak of the ships. Hear the prisoners below deck. Hear the children running through the first rough streets of the colony. Hear the old British voices breaking apart. Hear a new voice rising from the dust. Because the Australian accent is more than an accent. It is a ghost story, a survival story, a rebellion hidden in plain sound. It was born from exile, shaped by children, haunted by colonization, and carried into the modern world by millions of people who may not know that every word they speak contains an echo of Britain's unwanted voices, an echo of a land already ancient, an echo of a colony that learned to sound like itself. And maybe that is the final revelation. Britain sent convicts to the end of the world to erase them. But instead, they helped create one of the most recognizable voices on Earth.